Hello, my name is Cathy McLaughlin. I'm an art historian specialising in 19th century French painting, and I'm also a lecturer with Art Pursuits, a job which gives me wonderful opportunities to visit the places associated with my subject. My online lecture today is concerned with the work of Paul Cezanne, an artist closely linked with one particular area of France, Provence. I'm going to pick out just a few of his Provençal subjects and to compare them with more traditional landscapes by two other artists in order to assess what it is about Cezanne's work which makes him such an important figure in the history of landscape painting. Today, Provence is a hugely popular destination for travellers from all over the world. We go there to see the remains of the classical past, to explore its picturesque towns and landscapes, and of course to try the local food and wine. And our experience is inevitably enhanced when we reflect on the artists and writers who have drawn inspiration from these things in the past. In the second half of the 19th century, Provence was very far from the crowded tourist destination we know today, but it was enjoying a major cultural revival. In 1854, some local poets, headed by Frédéric Mistral, had set up a new association called Les Félibriges. The group aimed to revive the Provençal heritage, including its ancient dialect, the Languedoc, and in general asserted the status of Provence as a region set apart from the rest of France, with its own unique history and culture. Art had a part to play in this Provençal revival. A local school of painters based in Marseille had emerged by the 1860s, and artists from other parts of France were also arriving in increasing numbers. With its warm climate, classical monuments, and Mediterranean shoreline, Provence held the potential to be France's answer to Italy. I could cite many examples to illustrate this trend, but a single image probably makes the point more vividly. I've chosen Paul Flandrin's Souvenir of Provence, which is now in the Museum of Fine Arts in Dijon. Flandrin, a student of the leading neoclassical painter Ingres, was a respected and successful artist. The landscape here was shown at the 1874 Paris Salon, where it was widely praised by the critics and purchased by the French state. So it can give us a fair idea of what many people were looking for in a Provençal landscape. Let's now take a few minutes to examine Flandrin's painting. Overall, it conveys a remarkably sense of calm and equilibrium. Notice the balance between areas of light and dark, the framing of that brightly lit central area with trees and foliage, the sloping hillsides that intersect from left and right to create a balanced composition. Notice that the warm Mediterranean light is luminous but never glaring, and that the painting technique is highly refined with no obvious brush marks to disrupt our access into this beautiful view. Finally, take a look at those figures. The shepherd and shepherdess might belong to the present, but those two figures in the foreground with their robes and dignified poses refer us to a classical past. This is more than just one artist's personal souvenir of a particular site. We are being invited into an idyllic world that hovers eternally between past and present, an impossible dream perhaps, but for many people of the late 19th century, this is what the Mediterranean was all about. So when Cezanne started painting the landscapes of Provence in the late 1870s, he was joining a well-established trend, but he would distinguish himself from his contemporaries in two key respects. First, his relationship with the places he painted, and second, more importantly, in his technique. Cezanne's personal connection with Provence was a close one. He was born and brought up in Aix-en-Provence, where his father owned a bank. As a boy, he spent much of his leisure time swimming in the River Arc with his friends, one of whom was the future novelist Émile Zola. The sights Cezanne later painted in the Provençal landscape were therefore ones familiar to him since childhood. Cezanne also came to Provence with the eyes of an impressionist artist. During the 1870s, he worked and exhibited with members of the impressionist group. He was especially close to Camille Pissarro, and his technique would be strongly affected by their revolutionary approach to painting. Impressionism proposes that we focus on perception, basically how we see the world. A painting does not need to tell a story or communicate an idea or impart a moral. For an impressionist, the aim is simply to interpret in colour what we see in any particular place at any particular time. And in doing so, the impressionists want us, the viewers, to cast aside our assumptions about what we think we know, in fact, to try not thinking at all, and to see the world afresh. In reality, of course, perception involves thinking. We choose where to direct our gaze, our minds process and interpret the things we see. An artist also selects a viewpoint, decides what to include and exclude, finally how to compose nature into a painting. This implies in Impressionism, as for any other type of art, the difference is in the method. Impressionists seek to integrate seeing and process. Rather than work towards a preconceived idea devised in the studio, they work outdoors in front of the motif, translating their visual experience into the textures and colours of paint. Cezanne saw both the possibilities and the potential dangers of the Impressionist method. He realised the qualities of vibrancy, colour and light that could only be achieved in working directly from nature, but he had no wish to copy nature slavishly. Attention to perceived reality should not entail being blind to pictorial order. The artist, Cezanne believed, must bring thinking and looking into an alliance. Nor did he think that working from nature meant closing his eyes to the art of the past. On the contrary, Cezanne saw himself as working in response to the Western art tradition. He was drawn in particular to the work of the 17th century French landscape painter Nicolas Poussin. Once again, checks and balances came into play. Admiration for Poussin did not mean unthinking imitation of his work. Rather, the aim was to build on Poussin's legacy in modern terms, or as Cezanne put it, to redo Poussin over again according to nature. Let's see what Cezanne meant by this. Take a look at Poussin's landscape with two nymphs and a serpent, painted in 1659 and now in the Musée Condé in Chantilly. Our looking begins in the foreground area with its two figures on a low bank. This is a device known in landscape painting as a repoussoir. Its function, as the term suggests, is to push the landscape back, to create an illusionary sense of space. The dark area on the left, with its trees and buildings, finds an echo in the trees on the right. Together, these features frame the view and concentrate our gaze. Now see how Poussin structures that central area. Our eyes are guided into the distance via shifts in tone, dark, light, and contour lines, the curving slopes, the winding path, the lake and hills. Note that this is not an identifiable location, nor was it painted on site. While Poussin made many studies of the Italian countryside, a finished painting like this one would have been composed in his studio in Rome. He selected and then organised his motifs to achieve the desired result, a composition that was ordered, balanced and harmonious. Nor is there anything incidental about those two nymphs reclining in the foreground, calmly watching as a snake devours a bird in the shadows. That last detail, as the artist's contemporaries would well know, is lifted from a Roman mosaic that had been found in Palestrina in the early 17th century. We are reminded here that Poussin's perception of the natural world is filtered through a classical ideal of beauty. Now let's compare Poussin's landscape with one of Cezanne's from around 1887, now in the Courtauld Institute's collection in London. We see striking contrasts. First, and most obviously, Cezanne omits any human presence or reference to the classical world. This picture operates on a purely visual level. And we are looking not at a generalised view of nature, but at a particular site. We recognise, in fact, this view as one that Cezanne painted many times from the 1880s onwards, the Mont Sainte-Victoire, viewed from across the Arc Valley with its roads, building and railway viaduct. The bright tonality and luminous colours of Cezanne's painting, startling when compared with the Poussin, reflect the fact that Cezanne was not working in his studio but outside, choosing an elevated viewpoint southwest of Aix and painting directly from his motif. Cezanne has signed the work near the lower right-hand corner, quite unusual for him, and an indication that he was satisfied with the results. And yet when we look at this landscape alongside a photograph of the same view, we realise the extent to which he has interpreted his subject in painterly terms. The valley seems less expansive, the mountain much closer. Those branches appear almost to caress the mountain, echoing its curves and helping to draw it towards us, flattening the pictorial space. Lower down, a similar effect results from a branch projecting downwards so that it is aligned with a road in the valley. Cezanne, like Poussin, is searching here for pictorial harmony. We notice the tree and buildings on the left that, as in the Poussin, provide a jumping-off point for the distant view. We notice that the viaduct, barely visible in the photograph, here plays an important part in structuring the composition. And we see the shapes of the arches of that viaduct echoed in those of small buildings and trees dotted across the valley, where the fields, painted in luminous greens and oranges, create a diagonal grid pattern. You could say that Cezanne's perception of nature is mediated through his sense of pictorial design. He, of course, put it best. Art, he said, is a harmony parallel to nature. But this did not mean idealising nature in the manner of a salon artist. Let's go back now to Flandrin's Souvenir of Provence and compare it with another of Cezanne's works to see if we can pinpoint exactly what it is that makes Cezanne's approach so remarkable. The hillside in Provence, now in the National Gallery, was painted in the early 1890s, probably in the countryside around Aix. The exact location isn't known. In structural terms, this work presents a few similarities with Flandrin's. Both of them present clear breaks between foreground, middle ground and background areas. In the Cezanne, take a look at that play of curving lines between hillside, rocks and path, which I've highlighted here. Note that small patch of green in the lower left corner, surely a nod towards conventional framing devices. Cezanne is just as concerned as Flandrin is with pictorial effects, but he aims to achieve them in radically new ways. Take some basics: tone, line, colour. We have already seen Flandrin's heavy reliance on tone and line. Cezanne here deploys colour to achieve equivalent ends. When discussing his methods, he would apply the term modulation to describe his use of small patches of colour subtly graduated to suggest forms and spatial relationships. We see how the shapes of that rocky formation cutting across the foreground are literally sculpted in colour, blues and greys suggesting contours, shadows and recession in space, while the sunlit areas, treated in pale cream, yellow and orange, appear to project outwards towards us. We notice that the brighter, warmer colours dominate the left of the left foreground, but as we look to the right, cooler colours imply a greater distance from the viewer. In the upper part of the painting, Cezanne chooses a softer palette, applying patches of light green, blue and orange to indicate a hillside sloping backwards in space. Now let's consider technique. Rejecting the refined finish of a classical landscape like Flandrin's, Cezanne gives his painted surface an active role in the effect. The painting is uneven in its levels of finish. That foreground path is quite smoothly worked, the colours blended, in contrast to the heavier colours and directional brushstrokes being used to emphasise the rocky projections above. Trees and bushes are softer and more feathery in their treatment. One area, just near the centre, appears blurred. We may be looking through a gap in the foliage towards the distant hillside, but this is unclear. A point, perhaps, where Cezanne himself was unresolved? Just to the right, a group of buildings are also quite summarily treated, and the painting has not been signed, an indication that Cezanne had not finally completed it to his own satisfaction. Finished or unfinished, Cezanne's hillside in Provence helps us to understand what he was trying to do. While we look at the picture, it is almost as if we were tracking Cezanne's own gaze, his focused, methodical attention to the shapes of those rocks, the hiatus as he tries and perhaps fails to resolve that tricky area in the middle ground. As much as it represents a place, this landscape, with its ambiguities, its variable finish and uneven textures, represents the process of painting in action. It shows us Cezanne's sustained effort to resolve the problem he had set himself, how to capture nature as he saw it, while at the same time creating a work of art. The goal was somehow to integrate seeing, thinking and making. As Cezanne put it, je cherche en peignant. I seek while painting. Thank you very much for listening.